All right, life of Joash. You know Joash? We're going to meet a couple of ladies tonight that are like at different ends of the spectrum of good and bad. So the good, the bad, and one of them's probably ugly. I don't know.
Really?
But we are in 2 Kings 11. We're going to be 2 Kings 11 and 12 tonight. And I said earlier, you may not have heard me, but the same account, we finally brought 2 Chronicles and 2 Kings back together, where the 2 Kings and 1 Kings have primarily been in the northern kingdom, with Elijah and Elijah being used as prophets to come and to speak to their needs up there. And it's a listing of all the different kings of the north primarily, with some interaction from the south. If you remember, there's that split that happened right after Solomon, where Jeroboam and Rehoboam, they each were the first two leaders of those two parts. You had Israel in the north with the 10 tribes, and the two tribes, Judah and Benjamin, at the bottom, which was called Judah. David was king of Judah, so that's a lot. He was king of it all, but Judah is his tribe. So you've got more godly ones that were in the south. You didn't have any godly ones in the north. But of all the godly ones in the south, you had about 9 of them. That there was some language, like they did things that were pleasing to God. But by the end of their life, 8 out of the 9 had fallen away. And we're going to see Joash tonight, and he is going to do that exact same thing. But he's going to be good for a while. And you're going to see the difference of why he was good for a while and why he fell away. Athaliah. Don't ever name your child, grandchild, anybody Athaliah.
No.
You're going to find out why tonight. All right, last time we were together, we looked at Jehu. God chose Jehu. Elijah sent one of the sons of the prophets to anoint him and to tell him that he was called by God for a special mission. And that was to bring judgment, bring wrath upon the house of Ahab. And so he ended up killing both the king of Israel and the king of Judah, because there's all this intermixing that's been going on between the two houses. And after he killed the king of Judah, where actually Ahab and Jezebel's daughter had married into Athaliah, there's this vacuum, a vacuum of leadership. What would Jezebel do? Is what Athaliah is saying. What would mommy do? With this vacuum of power, they just killed my son, the king. And here I am, the queen grandmother. So what do I do? And we're going to see that. So anyway, the story shifts from north to south tonight. You're going to see that the rotten apple doesn't fall far from the tree. And just like she's asking that same question, what would Jezebel do? Satan asks that question as well. How to deal with this line of Judah and David. Because those are the covenant lines that are given. And all the way back to the Garden of Eden, Satan was warned that you're going to bruise the heel of the seed of the woman, but her seed is going to bruise your head. That's a death sentence to him. And so all the way he has been trying to eradicate this. He tried to corrupt the world so bad in Noah's day, God just destroy them all. That would have helped him. That would have been good for Satan if it wasn't for righteous Noah to be available to carry on the human race so that the Messiah, the line, could still go all the way to Messiah. Then you had this wicked Haman with this plot during Esther's day of trying to eradicate the Jews. And Pharaoh tried to do that. And then you have, later on in Bethlehem, you've got that attempt of destruction. But this is the thinnest it ever got. You get down to one single heir. You're one single heir away from the line of David being eradicated. And that covenant, that Davidic covenant that was made, being wiped out, being wiped off the charts, off the board. Would God allow that to happen? Satan got it all the way down to the nub. But he couldn't close the deal. Let me read out of 2 Chronicles 22 because this is not mentioned in 1 Kings. It's just 3 verses. It came about, this is verse 8. It came about when Jehu was executing judgment on the house of Ahab. He found the princes of Judah and the sons of Ahaziah's, who was the one who was killed, the king of Judah, brothers ministering to Ahaziah. And he slew them. So he wiped out a bunch of them right there. He also sought Ahaziah, and they caught him while he was hiding in Samaria up with the king of Israel, who was his uncle. They brought him to Jehu, put him to death, and buried him. For they said, he is the son of Jehoshaphat, who sought the Lord with all his heart. So there was no one in the house of Ahaziah to retain the power of the kingdom. Now back to 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 1. When Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, Jehu had killed him, she rose and destroyed. 2 Kings is what I meant. Thank you. I've even got that wrong in my notes. Huh? 2 Kings 11. Oh, I just read out of 2 Chronicles 22.
Yeah.
Because that's the same account, but it gives a little more of an intro. Y'all gonna have to keep up with me because I'm not only jumping around, but I'm messing around, obviously. I'm not doing it well. All right. The last phrase, she destroyed the royal offspring.
Everybody.
She's grandma. She wiped out her grandkids so that she could be the monarch.
Yeah, Queen's mother.
What a horrible grandmother. Just so she could take the throne. She wipes out her own grandchildren. But here's a name of a wonderful woman. The other end of the spectrum. Jehosheba. Jehosheba, the daughter of King Joram, sister of Ahaziah, the king who just got killed, took Joash, the son of Ahaziah, and stole him from among the king's sons who were being put to death. Placed him and his nurse in the bedroom. Kind of the language is like the bedroom, an area where you would collect all the bedding and all that. She hid him kind of amongst all the bedroom stuff.
How did the grandma not know that she missed a grandkid? Do you think so?
How did she not know what?
That she missed a grandkid.
She knew they were her grandkids. Is that what you asked? Well, that they had moved one up. They had a bunch of them. You know how many kids they got with all these wives?
Yeah.
It's like My 4 Wives or whatever these shows are nowadays, Sister Wives. But they had it on steroids. They were everywhere. So and he's only like 1 year old. So he's not even noticeable yet. 1 year old. So they hid him from Athaliah, and he was not put to death. And she's not personally putting him to death. So these others are doing this, and they're not familiar with them as she might be. All right. So, Jehosheba. It also says that she was the wife. Don't turn there. But back over in 2 Chronicles, it says Jehosheba was the wife of Jehoiada, the priest, the high priest. He's going to be important. Jehoiada.
I can't remember all these names.
Jehoiada. Well, just think of him somewhere. All right. So, Jehosheba, I'm having to say it. You're just having to hear it.
I feel bad for you. I really feel bad for you.
Jehosheba steps up, rescues her 1-year-old nephew, Joash. She's the wife of the high priest, so she would have quarters adjacent to the temple. That's what they did. She would take this baby, Joash, in there. Now, why are there not more babies born with and given the name Jehosheba? This lady is amazing. She's one of the most amazing ladies in
Why
Scripture.
don't you name your child Jehoshaphat?
Well, I might now if I have another one. Jehoshaphat. Yeah, talk to her.
I think that has a nice ring to it.
So, what did she do that was so great? She saved the entire line of David from extinction.
Yep.
Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat. Say it 4 times in a row. It'll start to slide off. All right, so he was hidden with her in the house of the Lord for 6 years. I bet he got annoying in that little space after 6 years. While Athaliah was reigning over the land. So now in Israel, the best place to hide something is in the house of God. And that's a good place to hide things from people. There's a lot of people. Athaliah is not heading into the house of God. She's not going to be in there worshiping and she just doesn't care about it. She's just letting it go into disrepair. I used to have a book in my library, not at this church, another church, don't go looking at my library, where I used to hide money. Because I didn't think anybody would look in this book. It looked like a dry book. Nobody's going to mess with that. And so I would hide some cash away, not like a whole bunch, but just so you'd have some cash. But that's a place nobody's going to be looking, you'd think. There was a story I heard about a young man who graduated from high school and he wanted a car. She knew it was there. He wanted a car, and his dad said, well, I'd really like for you to read this book. I want you to read that, and then we'll talk about the car. And so we gave him the book, and the boy looked at the book. He didn't want to read the book. And so he procrastinated. Dad would always ask, have you started the book? Are you reading the book at all? I'll get around to it, Dad. And so he never got around to it. And then he was fussing at his dad. Dad, I really wanted a car. I did not want a book. He said, well, did you ever look at the back of the book? He turned to the back of the book, and there, pasted at the back, was a check for the car. But he never read the book.
The check was out of date.
Yeah, now the check was not the right date. 90 days had gone by. Hidden in the house of God for 6 years. Samuel was raised in the house of God. If Hophni and Phinehas would have known that, sons of Eli, if they would have known that he was going to replace them someday, they probably would have been trying to kill him. But Athaliah didn't know an heir was still alive. And so she's just sitting on the throne every day, just smiling and thinking, boy, Mama would have loved this. This is the life Mama wanted to lead, being the queen over the land. And she did this for 6 years. And out of all of the kings in Chronicles, Book of Kings, only one female monarch. This is what you get when you get a female in charge. You get an Athaliah. Right? Mickey and I talked about this before. And he said this. I'm just quoting. Yeah. 7th year. Verse 4. 7th year of Jehoiada. In the 7th year, Jehoiada sent and brought the captains of the hundreds of the Kerites of the guard, brought them into the house of the Lord. And he made a covenant with them and put them under an oath in the house of the Lord and showed them the king's son.
Dun, dun, dun.
Just, what kind of moment is that? Okay, guys, I'm going to tell you something. I'm going to show you something. I want you to promise. This doesn't leave this room. And then, boop, 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 boop. Who's the kid? This is your king. Trots out little Joash. While all this wicked reign and life has been happening for 6 years, and he said, this is the king's son. We've been hiding him for 6 years. Proverbs says when the wicked reigns, that the people groan. People have been groaning for 6 years. And what a moment of hope when they pull out this little kid. And and explain who he is. And this is what Jehoiada said to them. This is a thing that you shall do. 1/3 of you who come in on the Sabbath and keep watch over the king's house, 1/3 shall also be at the gate, sir, 1/3 at the gate behind the guards, shall keep watch over the house for defense. 2/3 of you, even all of you who go out on the Sabbath, shall also keep watch over the house of the Lord for the king. It's actually a queen. Well, it's going to be a king now. Then you shall surround the king, each of his weapons in his hand, and whoever comes within the ranks shall be put to death. And you shall be with the king when he goes out and when he comes in. So the plan was during the changing of the guard, on the Sabbath day, when it wouldn't be unusual for a lot of guys to be there in guard uniforms, because they're changing. Some are headed home, some are just getting there. So it wouldn't be unusual, but you've got the best defense there at that moment. And they would do this on the Sabbath in the house of the Lord. You know what happens on the Lord's Day? You know, all the pagans are at home sleeping and on the golf course or fishing or shopping or something like that. Athaliah wouldn't be expecting it. She's sleeping in probably. So the captains of the hundreds did according to Jehoiada the priest commanded, and each one of them took his men who were to come in on the Sabbath and those who were to go out on the Sabbath, and came to Jehoiada the priest. And the priest gave to the captains of the hundreds the spears and shields that had been King David's. So they're really ramping this thing up. This is David's heir. We're going to use David's stuff, which are in the house of the Lord. The guards stood, each with his weapons in his hand, from the right side of the house to the left side of the house, by the altar and by the house, and around the king. This little boy is looking, look at all these guys with all these weapons. Then they brought out the king's son out. Look what they did to her. They put a crown on him. Can you see that crown just going clunk? His 7-year-old head. And they gave him the testimony. They gave him his own copy of the Word of God. And they made him king, anointed him, clapped their hands, and said, "Long live the king." You just hear it resonate through all of this. And this little 7-year-old boy is just sitting there, big-eyed, going, "Wow, what is all this about? I've been kept in this little confined area, and now I'm brought out here in the midst of all this." So they, long live the king. How would you have reacted? You remember being 7 years of age? How would you have reacted if all this was unfolding on you in 2nd grade?
That was his birthday, I think.
You know any 7-year-olds? What kind of kings and queens would they make? You know, candy in every pot, or, you know, video games in every house. I've got a 6-year-old granddaughter. I can't imagine her being queen over America.
I'm sure they had a mentor.
There we go.
I was thinking that too.
Yeah, remember that name.
Was your name Hill?
But, huh?
It was Nelda.
But anybody would be better than Athaliah. Even the last part of her name, Liah. She's a liar.
I bet she tried to kill him.
Verse 13. When Athaliah heard the noise of the guard and of the people, she came to the people in the house of the Lord. She looked, and behold, the king was standing by the pillar, according to the custom, with the captains and the trumpeters beside the king. And all the people of the land rejoiced and blew trumpets. And Athaliah tore her clothes and cried, "Treason! Treason!" What was it, pot calling the kettle black? You know, what is all the different ways you say this? You know, we have political leaders in our day that the strategy is, I'm going to call you what I am before you can call me what I am.
Yeah.
And here she's yelling, "Treason, treason," and she's the most treasonous person in the history of Israel. She wiped out all the potential heirs to the throne. And then she, as a non-heir, didn't have any royal blood in her other than Ahab and Jezebel. She takes the throne. And now she's yelling, "Treason, treason." Jehoiada, Dowahala, whatever his name is, I can't remember how I pronounce it. The priest, I'm just going to call him the priest, commanded the captains of the hundreds who were appointed over the army and said to them, "Bring her out between the ranks. Whoever follows her, put to death with the sword." For the priest said, "Let her not be put to death in the house of the Lord." So they seized her, and when she arrived at the horses' entrance of the king's house, she was put to death there. So she's taken out of God's house. We're not going to kill her here. And they take her to a very demeaning place where the horses come in and out. And they kill her there. So she doesn't die like a queen would normally die. Then Jehoiada made a covenant between the Lord and the king and the people, that they would be the Lord's people. Also between the king and the people. Here they have this recommitment moment with the king, the people, and God, and then the people and the king together as well. After 6 years of being led into this terrible Baal worship that Athaliah has been forcing upon them. And you wonder, when you are finally released after 6 years of being forced. This morning I put something on Facebook about the Chin people out of a book I'm reading called Persecuted or Global Assault on Christians. And it talked about the Chin people, how they live in a Buddhist society, and they are forced to worship Buddha. Even though they're Christians, and they're entirely Christian almost, but they are forced, because they're a minority, to do Buddha worship. And then I got a response on Messenger from, I've got this long list of folks, these pastors around the world, and one of them contacted me and said, "I am a Chin." He had read that, contacted me and told me, "I am a Chin." He's one of those folks. But they have been forced into Baal worship. When Baal worship had been happening under Jezebel, forcing it on the people all those years in the northern kingdom. Southern kingdom hadn't had that. Jehu had wiped it out up there. But now the little daughter, Athaliah, trickled down into the southern kingdom and got to that throne, and she was doing what Mama would have done, forcing that Baal worship. Well, what do? What would your first action be? All the people of the land went to the house of Baal and tore it down. The altars, images, they broke into pieces thoroughly. They killed Matan, the priest of Baal, before the altars, and the priest appointed officers over the house of the Lord. So their first act was, number one, to deal with evil. Deal with the idols. Deal with the false worship that was in their midst. We're going to recommit to God. What's our first thing we need to do? Get rid of what is not of God. When you come to the Lord and you give your life to Him, you surrender to Him, you need to look for your idols. You start cleansing the things that are in your life that shouldn't be there. And that's the number one thing that they did, that Athaliah revived this worship, and she'd been suppressing the worship of God for 6 long years. So number one, they got rid of all that represented the evil idols in their life. Verse 19, it says, he took the captains of hundreds and the Karaites and the guards and all the people of the land, and they brought the king down from the house of the Lord and came by the way of the gate of the guards to the king's house. He's got him a house now. And he sat on the throne of the king. You see him get a booster chair or something. Put him up there, and he's like swaddled up by this throne. So all the people of the land rejoiced, and the city was quiet. Quiet. The hearts were quiet. Peace was restored. And they had put Athaliah to death with the sword at the king's house, and Joash was 7 years old when he became king.
Well, they sure have said 7 years old a lot of times.
Yeah. 6 years, he's 7 years old now. But here he is, the rightful king is finally back on the throne after 6 years of Athaliah on the throne. Jesus is the rightful king. He belongs on the throne. But for a lot of people, they've got Athaliah. They've got Satan on the throne in their lives. They're living for the things that are more pleasing to him than the things that are pleasing to God. But the warning is there's going to come a day of reckoning, like there was for Athaliah and what there was for Jerusalem, when the rightful king was presented and restored. And you better hope you're on the right side of that they don't find you in the house of Baal, they find you in the house of the Lord. All right, chapter 12. In the 7th year of Jehu, Jehu's been up there for 7 years now, because he killed them, 7 years ago when he killed both kings. Joash became Jehoash. This is Joash. It's kind of like Joseph and Joey. It's kind of like a contraction that would be used with the name Joash. So you might see Jehoash, the same person. He became king, and he reigned 40 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Zebiah of Beersheba. Jehoash did right in the sight of the Lord all the days in which Jehoiada, the priest, instructed him. There's a clue. He did right all the days of Jehoiada. So, here, Jehu's still up there. He eradicated Baal worship. Athaliah tried to revive it. Now it's been eradicated in the south. So for the time being, Baal worship is definitely in retreat. But now you've got a new young king who is under the influence of a very godly high priest. And as long as that influence was in his life, it says he did what was right in the sight of the Lord. So influence matters. Influence matters. You think about the influences that are in your life. You think about the television, you think about the movies, you think about education, you think about even bad church situations, bad church leaders, bad teachers. You think about political leaders. If you measure the influences in your life and you take the influence God is having, how often are you in His Word? How often are you in prayer? How often are you and God connecting one way or another? And how often are you in the world connecting? You look at the influences. It made a difference with Joash. Because it says as long as he was under the influence of this very godly high priest, he was doing what was pleasing in God's eyes. It says only the high places were not taken away. The people still sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. Not a lot of the kings got rid of the high places, because often when a godly king came to reign, there had been a time where the temple, the house of worship, had been neglected, and the people had gotten into habits of, well, it's not even really available. It was even padlocked at one time when Josiah came to reign. And so they're going to worship somewhere. The people are going to worship. They say that less people are going to church in America, but they're worshiping. They're worshiping somewhere. They may go into a movie theater and they're worshiping those people on the screen or on Netflix. They may be listening to music and they're worshiping Lady Gaga or people like that. They're worshiping somebody. They may even worship themselves. They may go into gym and they're working out and they're worshiping their bodies. They're worshiping somewhere. Some people are worshiping at shopping malls, just spending that money, giving it to the God of the shopping stuff that comes back in their life. But here the people were going to the high places. And that's just kind of a natural thing that people do to worship. They go to the mountains. They feel like they can get more in touch with God there. Or they, at Oral Roberts University, they had the prayer tower.
Yeah.
Where they go up there and they pray for all your stuff letters and cards and with cash in them that you sent up to them. The high places. We think somehow if we just get a little closer to God, Tower of Babel, just get a little bit higher, that we are closer to the gods. And so they were still up there, and with the temple in disrepair, there wasn't really an option that was so good, because of that was not available to them. But Jehoash said to the priests, here's a guy that was raised in the temple. He knew it was in disrepair. all the money of the sacred things which is brought into the house of the Lord, in current money, both the money of each man's assessment and all the money, what they're responsible for, and all the money which a man's heart prompts him to bring, what they give over and above, into the house of the Lord. Let the priests take it for themselves, each from his acquaintance, and they shall repair the damages of the house wherever any damage may be found. So money was redirected for the repair and construction of the needs of the house of God. That's the influence that this high priest is having upon him. We got the house of God that's not what it should be. Let's do what we need to get it back up to speed. Now, one of the reasons why it wasn't what it should be, back in 2 Chronicles 23, it says this is one verse. For the sons of the wicked Athaliah had broken into the house of God, and even used the holy things of the house of the Lord for the Baals. Her kids were running around. Look, she's going to kill those kids. But her kids were destroying the house of the Lord. It came about in the 23rd year of King Jehoash that the priests had not repaired the damages of the house. Oh, no way. Preachers keeping money for themselves, buying jets. King Joash called for Jehoiada, the priest, and for the other priests, and said to them, why do you not repair the damages of the house? You got this money coming in just for that. Now, therefore, take no more money from your acquaintances, but pay it for the damages of the house. Don't keep collecting money. You take that money that you've been given and you fix that house. So the priests agreed that they would take no more money from the people, nor repair the damages of the house. They're going to have a new system that's put in place here. But the old system hasn't worked because it's gone through human hands and greed has gotten in the way. When we were in Brazil, one of the worst roads that you can imagine led to that orphanage. It was bumpy. I mean, you couldn't go slow enough or you wouldn't bounce your head off the top of the whatever they picked us up. It was a terrible thing they picked us up in from the airport, falling away. It had been given to them by a church, a ministry, but it was the worst thing you'd ever seen. But they picked us up, and we went through that road, and I said, they really need to fix this road. And the guy who was kind of in charge said, they fixed it 3 times, according to the books. They've collected money to fix it 3 times, but somebody else ran off with the money, the corrupt whatever, and didn't fix the road, but took the money and probably spread it around or kept most of it for themselves, whoever was in charge. And unfortunately, someone was lining their pockets here because the house of the Lord is not getting repaired. And the king decides that there needs to be a new system. So, verse 9, 2 Kings 12, Jehoiada the priest took a chest and bored a hole in its lid and put it beside the altar on the right side as one comes into the house of the Lord. And the priest who guarded the threshold put in it all the money which was brought into the house of the Lord. You got a place, they can't get into it. It's sealed. All you got is a little slot to put the money in. And when they saw that there was much money in the chest, the king's scribe and the high priest came up and tied it in bags and counted the money which was found in the house of the Lord. So those two very trustworthy guys came up and did it. They gave the money which was weighed out into the hands of those who did the work, who had the oversight of the house of the Lord, and they paid it out to the carpenters, the builders who worked on the house of the Lord, and to the masons and stone cutters, and for buying timber and hewn stone to repair the damages to the house of the Lord. That's pretty significant damage if you're doing all that. And for all that was laid out for the house to repair. But there were not made for the house of the Lord silver cups, snuffers, bowls, trumpets, any vessel of gold or vessels of silver from the money which was brought into the house of the Lord. For they gave that to those who did the work. They didn't have enough, I guess, just to pay for who was working, took the money. And with it they repaired the house of the Lord. Moreover, they did not require an accounting from the men whose hand they gave the money to pay to those who did the work, for they dealt faithfully. How can you trust your workers more than your priests? They trusted the priest and they got burned. Now they've got all these workers and they said they're going to be faithful guys. We're not going to make an accounting of them. We trust them. The money from the guilt offering and the money from the sin offerings was not brought into the house of the Lord, for it was the priest. So those two offerings they got to keep for themselves because they were guilty, sinful guys.
Yes.
Guilt offering and sin offerings. All right, seems like everything's going good. Let's stop the chapter right now. What could go wrong? Man dies.
Yeah.
A 130-year-old man dies. God had kept this guy with baling wire and duct tape going because Jehoiada needed to live. Because as soon as he dies, things are going to change. 2 Chronicles 24, 15 and 16, here's two verses. When Jehoiada reached a ripe old age, you get old, you get ripe. I guess that's what it's saying. He was 130 years old at his death. 130. David lived to be 70, and he was old, is what they said, described him. This guy's 130. They buried him in the city of David among the kings because he had done well in Israel and to God and to his house. He was so well respected that they didn't bury him with the priests. They buried him with the kings. He had been the king's confidant and mentor and made all the difference. Because if he wouldn't have been there, it would have been a whole different reign. But he died at 130. So he is a great guy. And if you're going to have twins, Jehoiada and Jehoshaphat, that would be a good name for
There you go, man.
a twin boy and girl. You call them, you shorten it to Jeho. They both start with the same thing. So, with Jehoiada gone, a new influence comes into Joash's life. And he listens to these new voices, and they are going to lead him to demise and destruction. Verse 17 of 2 Kings 12. After the death of Jehoiada, the officials of Judah came and bowed down to the king. And the king listened to them. They abandoned the house of the Lord, the God of their fathers, and they served the Asherim, the female side of the equation of Baal, and the idols. So wrath came upon Judah and Jerusalem for this guilt. So they head back this pagan direction like we're doing as a nation right now. They turn away from the house of God. They turn away from Jesus like we're doing. And they turn toward paganism. They turn away from God. We don't want God talked about in our schools. We don't want to hear prayers. We don't want to have the Word of God taught. We're going to make God unconstitutional everywhere we can. No nativity scenes. We don't want to be thinking about Jesus. And they head back this pagan direction. So what is God's response? Number one, he sends prophets to them. He sends prophets. God is always seeking to save us from ourselves. And so he sends a warning. He sends prophets. In verse 19 it says he sent prophets to them to bring them back to the Lord. And they testified against them.
Are we in Chronicles? Sorry.
Thank you.
How did I go to Chronicles?
Yes.
Yeah, it's Chronicles.
Chronicles 22.
Just listen. Just listen. All right, it's Chronicles. 2 Chronicles 24, 19 and 20. But they would not listen. Now look at this. You can't look at it because you're not in Chronicles. But listen to this. Then the Spirit of God came upon Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada, the priest. And he stood above the people and said to them, so here's his son of the guy that was 100. His son's got to be forever old too.
You can't never tell.
Yeah, well, so thus God has said, why do you transgress the commandments of the Lord and do not prosper? Because you have forsaken the Lord, he has also forsaken you. So he warns them about this new direction. You've forsaken God. Guess what happens when you forsake God? Romans 1. God forsakes you. God gives you over. Some of the worst consequences of sin is ourselves, our sin nature released upon ourselves. Has God forsaken America? I mean, what are you seeing around us that looks like God's forsaken America? He's given us over to the worst sins that societies have indulged in. I mean, we are, if it was a horse race, look out, Sodom, we've about got you. We're coming up on your right, on your left, either side. We're about to pass. So, 2 Chronicles. They conspired against him, and at the command of the king, they stoned him to death in the court of the house of the Lord. So what is sweet little Joash's response to the son of his great mentor? Stone him. Stone him. Thus Joash the king did not remember the kindness which his father Jehoiada had shown him, but he murdered his son. And as he died, Zechariah said, "May the Lord see and avenge." May the Lord see and avenge. Those are his last words. I hope those are not my last words. Okay, Lord sees what you're doing right now, and he's going to avenge you for this. But this would be, the forsaking of God would be seen, we're going back to 2 Kings 12, will be seen immediately in what happens next. Remember Hazael? He was the one that came before Elijah, and Elijah wept, looking at him because he said, "I can see what you're going to do. You're going to become king of Assyria or Aram, and you're going to kill so many of my people, Israel." Hazael, king of Aram, went up and fought against Gath and captured it. And Hazael set his face to go up against Jerusalem. Jehoash, king of Judah, took all the sacred things that Jehoshaphat and Jehoram and Ahaziah, his fathers, kings of Judah, had dedicated, and his own sacred things, and all the gold that was found among the treasures of the house of the Lord and of the king's house, and he sent them to Hazael, king of Aram. Then he went away from Jerusalem. Now that skips a step, because back in 2 Chronicles, it describes why he was willing to pay him off. 2 Chronicles 24, it says, and I think verse 24, it says, "Indeed, the army of the Arameans came with a small number of men, yet the Lord delivered a very great army into their hands, because they had forsaken the Lord, the God of their fathers." They didn't bring a big army. Hazael didn't bring a big army, but Joash went out to fight him, and he got conquered with a big army against a little army because God had forsaken him. Now, what are you going to do with a guy like Joash that God's hand is now off of? Verse 19, the rest of the acts of Joash and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? You know that they are. His servants arose, made a conspiracy, and struck down Joash at the house of Milo as he was going down to Silla. For his servants struck him, and he died, and they buried him with his fathers in the city of David, and Amaziah his son became king in his place. Guess where you get a little more information? 2 Chronicles 24. Thus they executed judgment on Joash, and when they had departed from him, for they had left him very sick, his own servants conspired against him because of the blood of the son of Jehoiada. They were upset that he had had him murdered, and murdered him on his bed. They murdered Joash on his bed, so he died, and they buried him in the city of David, but they did not bury him in the tombs of the kings. Here's a king that didn't get buried with kings after this priest got buried with kings. That's what the people thought of him. So 3 things. I don't even know what time it is. 3 things. Number 1, make sure you have the right king on the throne of your life. Make sure you have the right king on the throne of your life. Not Athaliah. Don't let Satan be on the throne of your life. Don't let the world be on the throne of your life. Make sure the rightful king is there and not hidden away somewhere. You know, we don't want to be hiding Jesus away. We want him out in the open and reigning and ruling in our lives no matter what comes. Number two, make sure that you're listening to the right influences in life. Make sure you're listening to God. You're carving out room in your life to hear God. And that you are getting rid of the areas of influence that shouldn't be there. Now, don't give Satan strongholds. Don't give him room to influence you. And number three, make sure that you're willing to do the hard things. Make sure you're willing to tear down your idols, the hard things. Make sure you're willing to build up God's place of worship. Make sure there's a price to your faith. I mean, we're looking at a day when we are acclimating to the world and truth is trumped by tolerance. Instead of dealing with the hard things, we're trying to build bridges to it, thinking somehow they're going to fall in love with us somewhere along the way and think we're really cool. And that'll bring them to God when we're living as far from God as we possibly could and still trying to call ourselves His children. Be willing to take a stand on the hard things, because that's the first thing that they did when they really committed themselves to God. Was it going to take 6 years of wicked oppression to finally get you to wake up and realize that it's worth it? They had realized it was worth it. They didn't want any more Athaliah. And they wanted to get rid of anything that she had accomplished that was keeping them from having the road back to God that they wanted. All right, let's